I wasn't looking for it. That's the part that still stays with me. I wasn't on a research trip. Wasn't following a map or a trail marked in any book. I was walking a ridge in the deep back country, the kind of place where the forest has been growing undisturbed long enough that the trees themselves feel older than anything you've seen before, and I almost walked past it entirely. A depression in the ground, a line of stones that was too straight to be natural, a shape in the tree line that didn't belong to the trees. I stopped, and I stood there for a long moment before I understood what I was looking at. A cabin, or what had once been a cabin, still standing, barely on two of its four walls, but standing, logs dark with 2 centuries of weather. A stone chimney at the far end, more intact than anything else, rising out of the leaf litter like it had decided it was going to outlast everything around it. And it had. I didn't go inside right away. I'm not sure I could have explained why, standing there in that cold morning light, I felt the need to just stop and look and let the place be what it was for a moment before I started trying to understand it, because something about it asked for that. These old places always do. The cabin sat in a hollow just below the eastern face of a long ridge, positioned, I would later understand, with more intention than it first appeared. Protected from the north wind by the ridge itself, angled to catch the low winter sun from the south, close enough to a spring I found 20 yards uphill that the distance between water source and home could have been covered in under a minute, even in deep snow. Whoever built this place, they knew what they were doing. The logs were hand-hewn. You could still see the marks, the broad axe cuts, long and deliberate, flattening each face of the timber so it would seat tightly against the log below. No chainsaw has that signature. No mill either. Just a man with an axe and the knowledge of how to use it, shaping each log the way a craftsman shapes wood, reading the grain, working with the tree rather than against it. The notching at the corners was a style I recognized from the oldest documented cabins in this part of the mountains. A half dovetail, angled on one face, flat on the other, that locked each log into the one below it with a mechanical precision that needed no nails, no spikes, no hardware of any kind. Just wood, cut correctly, holding itself together through geometry alone. 200 years of wind and ice, and the slow pressure of the surrounding forest, and those corners were still tight. The chimney was what drew me closer first. It was built from stone gathered from the slope nearby. You could see the same geological signature in the chimney rocks and in the outcroppings on the ridge above. Someone had spent a long time collecting these stones, sorting them, finding the flat-faced ones that would stack cleanly and the irregular ones that could be fitted into gaps to lock the whole structure together. The hearth opening was wide, wider than a modern fireplace would ever be built. Because this wasn't decorative. This was the center of everything that happened in that cabin. Cooking, heating, light in the darkness. The place where the family gathered when the temperature outside dropped past the point where any other part of the cabin was comfortable. The fireback, the rear wall of the fireplace, was angled forward slightly at the top. Not by accident. That angle reflected heat outward into the room rather than letting it rise straight up the flue, a design principle that engineers would later study and explain with fluid dynamics and thermodynamics. But the mountain builder who angled that fireback didn't know those words. He just knew that an angled back kept his family warmer. And so he built it that way. Inside what remained of the walls, the floor was gone, rotted back into the earth it had come from, as wood eventually does. But the earth beneath it told a story. There was a depression in the center of what had been the main room. Circular. Deliberate. The kind of depression that gets worn into a dirt floor over years of feet returning to the same spot. The spot closest to the fire, closest to the warmth, closest to the heart of the home. I stood in that depression and thought about how many mornings had started here, how many winters had been endured from this exact spot, how many children had sat here, close to the fire, while the world outside went white with snow and the wind moved through the hollow like something that wanted in. Along the wall that was still mostly intact, I found the remnants of shelving. Wooden pegs driven into the logs at intervals, The kind of simple storage system that needed no brackets, no hardware store. Just straight-grained wood, dried hard, hammered into pre-bored holes, and left to swell tight over time. On one of those pegs, still hanging after what I can only estimate was more than a century of abandonment, a single iron hook. Curved, hand-forged. The kind of thing a blacksmith made one at a time at a forge, shaping hot metal with a hammer over an anvil, judging temperature by color and consistency by feel. I held it for a long time. It was heavier than I expected. Everything the old craftsmen made was heavier than you expect, because they made things to last, made them without the assumption that something cheaper and lighter would be available to replace it in a few years. Made them as if the thing they were making might need to serve their grandchildren. And sometimes, it did. Near the chimney base, half buried in leaf litter and the accumulated debris of decades, I found the stone threshold of what had been a small door, not the main entrance. A second opening, low and narrow, cut into the side wall close to the floor. I had read about these. Some historians call them root cellar access points, small openings that allowed a family to reach underfloor storage without going outside in the dead of winter. A way of keeping the cold air from entering the main living space every time someone needed to retrieve food from beneath the floorboards. The stone threshold was worn smooth in the center, worn by hands, by the repeated passage of a person reaching through a low opening, in the dark, by feel, knowing exactly where the stored apples were, where the potatoes sat in their sand, where the crocks of fermented vegetables lined the cool earth wall. That worn stone is not an artifact, it is a gesture. The repeated gesture of a person feeding their family through winter, made so many times that it left a mark in stone. What I found in this cabin wasn't treasure in any way that would register on a screen or in a museum catalog. No coins. No tools still bright enough to identify. No written records. No names carved in the walls. No dates scratched into the chimney stone. What I found was a way of thinking, pressed into the placement of every log, the angle of every cut, the position of every element relative to every other element. The spring above the cabin, not beside it, not below it, but above, where gravity could bring the water down. The chimney in the center of the structure, not at the end, not against an outside wall where the heat could bleed out into the cold, but in the heart of the home, where the stone mass could radiate warmth in every direction through the night. The second opening near the floor, not an oversight in the design, not a later addition, but an intentional feature that kept the cold outside and the food accessible through the months when going outside meant risking everything. None of these things were accidents. Every one of them was a decision, made by someone who had thought carefully, very carefully, about what winter required and what the mountain offered and how to bring the two together in a way that kept a family alive. I have been in a lot of old buildings, stone structures in Europe that are older than this country, log cabins reconstructed in living history museums, documented homesteads with plaques and parking lots and guided tours, and I have never felt, in any of them, what I felt standing in that hollow. Because this cabin had no plaque. Nobody had decided it was worth preserving. Nobody had written it into a historical record or put a fence around it or given it a name. It had simply continued to exist. In the place where it was built. In the hollow where the spring still runs 20 yards uphill. On the ridge that still blocks the north wind, the way it blocked the north wind 200 years ago, when someone stood in this exact spot and decided this was the place. The mountain kept it, the way the mountain keeps everything it decides to keep, quietly, without ceremony. Long past the point where anyone was paying attention, I left the cabin the way I found it. Didn't take the iron hook, though I thought about it. Didn't move any of the stones. Didn't disturb the threshold. Didn't mark the location in any way that would make it easier to find. Some places are worth leaving alone. Some knowledge is worth letting rest in the place where it was made, rather than pulling it out into a world that might not know what to do with it. Walking back up the ridge in the late afternoon light, I kept thinking about the person who built that cabin. I don't know their name. Don't know if they were a man or a woman, young or old, alone or part of a family that helped raise those walls. but I know they were paying attention to the spring, to the ridge, to the wind direction and the sun angle and the way cold air pools in low ground on a still night. They were paying attention in a way that most of us have forgotten how to pay attention. And what they built from that attention stood for 200 years in a hollow that nobody else bothered to find. I think about that more than I probably should. The things that last, the things that are built carefully, with full attention, by someone who understood that the mountain was not an obstacle. It was the answer. You just had to be still enough, and quiet enough, and patient enough to let it show you where to build.